Putin loves to act like Russia's great protector. He wants everyone to believe he's the only thing standing between Russia and total chaos. But here's the truth: the image is falling apart, and fast. Take the Moscow theater hostage crisis in 2022. Instead of showing strength, Putin's response showed a leader who's lost control of his people and his military. British expert Roger Boys called it what it is: a disaster for Putin's reputation. And that's a big problem for a guy whose entire career is built on looking tough. If Putin can't protect Russia, why would anyone want him in charge? Now things are getting worse. Russia's losing wars, drone strikes are hitting Moscow, and even his own people are starting to turn against him. The cracks in Putin's strongman act are everywhere, and the whole thing is about to collapse. Is Russia heading for a civil war? To find out, let's start with the lie Putin built his power on, being Russia's great protector. Putin has spent most of his reigns, both as Russia's president and prime minister, developing the image of himself as a strongman. He's achieved this both through his actions and the way he deals with people who even think about questioning his decisions. For example, The Guardian reports on an incident involving Putin and an American journalist during a press conference at a hotel in Davos. The journalist asked a question that seemed to irritate Putin. Rather than answering, Putin deflected by pointing out a large ring on the journalist's finger. "Why is the stone so large?" Putin asked as a few of the journalist's peers began to nervously giggle. Moving into a mocking tone, Putin continued, "You surely don't mind me asking, because you wouldn't be wearing something like that unless you were trying to draw attention to yourself." The Russian leader's bullying was complete, and the initial question he faced, the one that raised his ire in the first place, fell out of view. That incident is a microcosm of how Vladimir Putin is as a leader. He's a man who bullies and cajoles to get what he wants. Putin will denigrate his adversaries, no matter how minor, to place himself in a position of strength and power over his enemies. With the journalist, that bullying allowed him to avoid answering a tricky question. On the wider geopolitical scale, Putin uses Russia's military might to get his way. We saw this with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. His attack on Georgia 6 years before similarly showed Putin's propensity for using power to cower the nations. Of course, the special military operation he started against Ukraine in 2022 is yet another example. Putin demonstrates his strength through Russia's military, accompanying his attacks with rhetoric designed to show the Russian people that he's the only man who can protect them. Russians tend to respond well to strongman leaders. But the Moscow terrorist attack revealed that there were chinks in Putin's armor. Those attacks, according to Boys, exposed at once the shakiness of his claim to be Russia's sword and shield, the unpreparedness of the security apparatus for a new threat, and the low credibility of the regime's war rhetoric. Putin's shaky response to the attacks didn't help, as he vainly tried to link them to Ukraine despite it being clear that the strike was the work of Islamist fundamentalists. More incidents followed. On August 6, 2024, Ukraine launched a surprise invasion of the Kursk Oblast, smashing through poorly guarded border checkpoints. Around a dozen 400-person Ukrainian battalions made quick progress. They've since captured 400 square miles of Russia's territory, with Putin seemingly unable to dislodge the Ukrainian invaders in the months since. He's become so desperate that he's calling on North Korea to provide him with soldiers to fight against Ukraine in Kursk. Putin tried to downplay the Kursk invasion. He claimed the invading force was much smaller than it really was, with the Kremlin also stating that the uncontrolled ride of the enemy has already been halted, a little over a week after it began. That turned out to be a lie. Instead, everyday Russians in Kursk were forced to evacuate en masse. Why does all of this matter in the context of a brewing civil war in Russia? Putin built his entire image around being a protector of the Russian people. His wars have reinforced that image, allowing him to showcase Russia, and himself by extension, as a major world power. The Moscow terrorist attack damaged the carefully crafted perception of Putin. Kursk shattered it. Russia's leader was reduced to lying to his own people as they were forced to evacuate from their homes. Now, with North Korea involved, he's also being forced to rely on other countries to defend his own. None of this will go down well with the people Putin rules. They've already been forced to watch as what was meant to be a days-long special military operation has evolved into a war of attrition, with Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claiming it's led to over 696,000 Russian casualties as of November 2024. Now they're being attacked on their own turf. Ukraine's September 2024 drone attack on Moscow, which damaged buildings and led to the death of one Russian civilian, only emphasized the message: Putin is not as strong as he claims to be. That lack of strength is complemented by the Russian leader's inability to adapt to crises as they unfurl before him. We already see that in Kursk. as his slow response is the main reason why the oblast is under a state of emergency. Ukraine still controls the territory it took in Kursk several months after the invasion. Putin and his people received a dose of their own medicine, and you can guarantee that the Russian population doesn't like it. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, points out other incidents in which Russia's leader has been slow to adapt. After Ukraine put up its resistance to the initial invasion Putin launched, Russia's leader took months to change his strategy. He kept attacking the biggest targets possible with insufficient forces, the ISW says, with mobilization only coming after Ukraine routed Russia in Kharkiv in September 2022. He's also utterly failed to change the tactics that have led to hundreds of thousands of Russian casualties in the war. Putin is happy to keep the meat grinder churning while everyday Russians lose family members to his special military operation. These delayed reactions to very real problems expose the man behind the rhetoric. Putin is not the protector that he's always claimed to be, and that's a problem for Russia's leader, for a very clear reason: his people are starting to turn against him. Putin's strongman image has not only allowed him to project strength internationally, it's also enabled him to quell dissent in his own country to prevent any prospect of a civil war that could unseat him from power. But now the dissenting voices are getting much louder. In March 2024, Reuters reported on thousands of Russians turning up at polling stations across their country to take part in a peaceful protest against Putin. The action was dubbed the Noon Against Putin, with Russians arriving at polling stations at midday to either vote for opposing candidates or spoil their ballots in protest of unfair elections. Some even wrote Alexei Navalny's name on their ballot papers. That's important because Putin imprisoned Navalny before the election took place, with the opposition's leader later dying in prison. Putin still won the Russian presidency by a landslide with 87% of the vote. But the fact that such a mass protest could be organized and actually take place in a country he attempts to hold so clearly under his thumb indicates that there's rising resentment against Russia's leader. There are other small signs that everyday Russians are turning against their leader. In the wake of the Kursk invasion, Putin's popularity among his people fell by 3.3% to 73.6%, according to Russian pollster VTS-IOM. That may seem like a small drop, especially considering presidential approval ratings are typically lower than 73.6% in other countries, but it was the largest decline recorded since Putin invaded Ukraine. In September 2024, more polls revealed that a large number of Russians are also turning against Putin's war. The Kyiv Independent reported on a poll conducted jointly by Chronicles and Extreme Scan that found 49% of Russians want an immediate withdrawal from Ukraine. That's an increase of 10% over the number who said the same in a similar poll conducted in February 2023. Opinions about Putin's war have soured so much that many Russians feel that Putin is going to get nothing from his special military operation. That's according to a July 2024 report in Foreign Policy. It claims that asking the average Russian what they want out of the war will lead to the same response: nothing. This indicates that Russia's population, for all of its outward support for the war, actually can't see how it benefits them. Instead, what they see is a leader who's cost their country hundreds of thousands of people, a leader who has invited attacks in the motherland, as seen in Moscow and Kursk, a leader who may no longer be fit for purpose. Don't underestimate the importance of people power to Putin's reign. Though he's an autocrat verging on being a dictator, Putin knows that it's his own people that serve as the foundation for his power. That's why he's poured so much into building up the image of himself as a strongman. But there's an undercurrent of political cynicism in Russia, bred in part by Russian people understanding that they are constantly being lied to. Foreign Policy says there's even a phrase in Russia that highlights the discrepancies between what the average Russian sees on state-run television and the realities of their lives. Battle between the TV and the refrigerator. Putin has long relied on this political apathy to prop himself up in power. He can trust his turbo-patriots to bang the drum for him, while knowing that most Russians only want to get on with their lives outside of his political machinations. The problem he now faces, and the issue that could lead Russia to civil war, is that Putin's people are starting to wake up politically. Thousands actively protested the Russian presidential elections despite Putin having a track record of obliterating his political opponents. Most Russians believe they'll get nothing from the Ukraine war, with almost half now supporting a withdrawal. And Putin's popularity is on the wane in the wake of the Kursk invasion. These are all signs that the undercurrent of Russian apathy that has served Putin so well for so long is slowly transforming into one of opposition. Russia's leader is struggling to maintain control, and as his grip on power fades, so too does the prospect of civil war in Russia rise. Putin knows this. That's why he spent the first half of 2024 trying to consolidate his political power base. In May 2024, The Guardian published a piece discussing how Putin has turned to shoring up the military-industrial complex he created with the Ukraine war to maintain his grip on power. We saw this in the sidelining of Nikolai Patrushev. Long believed to be a potential successor to Putin, Patrushev was instead pushed to the sidelines when Putin replaced Sergei Shoigu with Andrei Belyusov as his defense minister. Shoigu took Patrushev's role as the head of Russia's Security Council, leaving Putin's supposed successor and potential political rival out in the cold. Patrushev ended up as a presidential aide for shipbuilding, a nothing role that was a massive downgrade from his previous position. Even Shoigu's shift was seen as Putin potentially getting a handle on a political rival, according to The Guardian. Shoigu had grown too powerful for Putin, likely because of the direct military contact that being the defense minister delivered. So Putin removed him too, though not quite to the degree of what he did to Patrushev. Why does any of this matter to Russia brewing civil war? It shows that Putin understands that his power is under threat not only because of the changing opinions of his people, but because he's starting to see political rivals within the Kremlin. Russian political scientist Mikhail Sava says as much, noting that Shoigu's removal from power had nothing to do with the man's corruption. In those circles, everyone steals, Sava noted, before adding that the move was supposed to accomplish two things for Putin: retake control of the Russian military and remove any internal threats to his power. The appointment of Belyusov to defense minister was no coincidence. He's an economist who strongly believes that the Russian state should drive the country's economy, aligning perfectly with Putin's wartime vision. He also has no loyal supporters who would back him should he want to turn against Putin. In fact, he owes his position to Putin, unlike Shoigu, who had support from those outside of Putin's grasp. These are all signals that cracks are forming in the Kremlin. Putin is surrounding himself with yes men who aren't going to argue against any of the policies he wants to implement. That may seem ideal for an autocratic leader. A lack of opposition means he can do whatever he wants, but there are problems with this approach in the long term. With issues in the Kremlin forming, Putin could see his power base erode further if the Ukraine war doesn't go his way, according to Mayak intelligence director Mark Galeotti. That's already the case. Since Putin made his Defense and Security Council changes, Ukraine has invaded Russia. Putin is no closer to achieving his special military operation objectives than he was at the beginning of 2024. As for the state of Russia, the war is draining the country's economy in ways that could lead to a dual revolt by the people and the political players Putin is trying to sideline. Let's hone in on Russia's economy for a moment. The Carnegie Endowment for Peace says Russia's economy is at threat of overheating. Inflation is far above the target rate of 4%. Russia's central bank forecasts inflation between 8 and 8.5% by the end of 2024, and interest rates are extremely high. Russia is operating inside a financial bubble, according to Carnegie. It's recording high gross domestic product growth, and wages are rising across multiple sectors, but all of that growth is tied to the wartime economy that Putin has created. What happens to this growth when the Ukraine war ends? That's a question Putin doesn't want to answer, which is why he's in no rush to stop the fighting in Ukraine. The problem will come when these economic woes come to bear on the Russian people. They're already dealing with financial problems. Inflation means the cost of living is rocketing sky high, with the interest rate issues making it harder to borrow money. Those may not be big enough problems to trigger a civil war in Russia alone, but when you combine them with the deterioration of Putin's strongman image, increasing anti-war sentiment, and strife within the Kremlin, a picture starts to form. Putin's grip on power is slipping, and he's struggling to hold on as Russia slowly turns against him. Still, the issues we've highlighted are all indirect signals that Russia is sliding ever closer to civil war. The average Russian isn't about to rise up against Putin, even as they increasingly disagree with what he's doing. At least there won't be a revolt unless one is led by somebody who has more power than the people Putin is struggling to control. Enter the mercenary groups and the oligarchs. Putin relied on mercenary groups such as the infamous Wagner during the early stages of the Ukraine war. These paramilitary forces supplemented the army that Putin sent into Ukraine, but they weren't directly under Putin's control. That issue came to a head in June 2023, when Wagner's then leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, took control of all of the Russian military sites in Rostov-on-Don. That move led to a brief march on Moscow as Prigozhin levied accusations at Putin of lying about his justifications for the war and even killing Wagner fighters in friendly fire rocket attacks. The internal insurrection was put down fairly quickly, with Prigozhin later dying suspiciously in a plane crash in August 2023. That direct revolt was another shot to Putin's strongman image, but it's one he ended quickly, which may lead you to wonder why it's a signal that Russia is heading towards civil war. But the answer is that Prigozhin isn't the only mercenary leader who's turned against Putin. On August 22, 2024, The Hill reported that private military company leader Georgy Zakrevsky was calling on Russians to get rid of the Great Putin. "Our country is not just on the brink of disaster or already right next to it," Zakrevsky claimed. "Our country is in trouble, big trouble. Drones are flying all over central Russia, right up to Moscow and St. Petersburg." The mercenary leader went on to bemoan the extensive losses in Russia's Black Sea Fleet and how Ukraine has managed to push Russia's air force out of the country. The diatribe positioned Putin as a weak military tactician, with Zakrevsky concluding by saying, "We call on everyone to join our union to save our country," while speaking to the soldiers in the Ukrainian trenches. It's an active call to arms to Russia's military. Zakrevsky wants Putin's forces to revolt, to down tools in Ukraine and turn against their leader, while the signals of civil war we've spoken about so far suggest a brewing undercurrent of discontent. This attempt to push Russians into action against their leader is as overt as they come. Zakrevsky may be trying to turn himself into Putin's successor. If he's successful, he'd likely be little different to Russia's leader in terms of taking an autocratic and military-focused approach to his reign. But achieving that power would come at the cost of a civil war for which the mercenary leader hopes he can gain support from Russian soldiers and the increasingly unhappy country's population. These two examples of mercenary revolt are already a big enough problem for Putin, given that people like Zakrevsky control enough people to launch concerted and direct attacks against him. Perhaps even worse for Putin is that he's starting to lose the support of the oligarchs. When he came to power, Putin cleverly made Russia's oligarchs dependent on him for their wealth. He offered the mega-rich who had controlled Russia in the post-Soviet era a choice: bend to my will or be removed. Many chose the former, with those who didn't ending up disappearing or being imprisoned as Putin consolidated his power. NPR notes that Putin has also made dozens of Russian men, and it's practically always men, very wealthy in the years since the initial warning. The oligarchs depend on Putin for their money, which would seemingly make them the very last group of people that would stand up to Russia's leader, who would bite the hand that feeds them. Business tycoon Oleg Deripaska would. Already feeling the pain of Western sanctions implemented against Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, Deripaska took Putin to task in an August 2024 interview. You may start to notice some correlation here. Deripaska and the mercenary leader Zakrevsky both spoke out in the days following Ukraine's invasion of Kursk. That's no coincidence. Both likely smelled an opportunity to chip away at Putin's power. The Moscow Times reports that Deripaska said, "If you want to stop the war, first you need to stop the fire," as he called for an unconditional ceasefire. The billionaire also criticized Putin's wartime spending, which had cost Russia over $211 billion at the time of Deripaska's comments. Deripaska isn't the only Russian oligarch to speak out against Putin. August 2023 saw another, Arkady Volzo, label Russia's Ukrainian invasion as barbaric. Oleg Tinkov of Tinkoff Bank also renounced his Russian citizenship when Putin launched his special military operation. Of course, these are just a handful of the dozens of oligarchs that Putin has under his thumb, but again we see the seeds of dissent being sown. All three oppose Putin's war, whether that be because of its brutality or the impact it's having on their bank accounts. The odds are that there are many more who are afraid to speak out or are simply biding their time before they do. What does all of this mean for Putin and his control over Russia? Well, it's all bad news. He's facing up to a country that is increasingly losing confidence in his ability to defend his people against the threats that his own policies create. The Moscow terrorist attack was just the start. Putin's mismanagement of the aftermath of that attack was already a problem. Ukraine invading Kursk, being so successful in Crimea, and launching drone attacks against Moscow further showcase to the Russian people that what they see in state-sponsored media doesn't align with reality. Those people are starting to turn against their leader. Almost half want to see a withdrawal from Ukraine, with most feeling they'll get nothing out of the war. Russia's economy is also looking shaky in the long term, with the people who are dissatisfied with Putin having to deal with rising inflation and interest rates. Then there are the mercenaries and the oligarchs. Russia's people may not have the power to do much about Putin, but the individuals who fall into these categories do. Mercenary groups are revolting, with some calling on Russia's military to do the same, and we're starting to see oligarchs, many of whom were enriched by Putin, calling the Russian leader out. Add political turmoil within the Kremlin, spotlighting Putin's desperate efforts to retain control, and you get a Russia that's teetering closer and closer to civil war. That war may take a while to come. However, the strong man is weakened, and it may only take a couple more blows to his reputation for Russia to rise against him. But what do you think about the situation in Russia? Is Putin losing his grip on power so much that civil war is on the horizon? Or will Russia's leader manage to use his old tricks to maintain power, even as people in his own country begin to resent him? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching this video.